Jessica Watkins of King's College London, community policing and creating consent in Jordan.
Great, thanks. Well, now for something completely different. I'm going to be talking about research based on my PhD, which was on policing in Jordan, and I principally argued that police, even in non-democratic and illiberal settings, in this case Jordan, can be central to the production of social order and specifically consent. So today I'm focusing specifically on community policing, which is one aspect of that. And I'm looking at how members of the police that I spoke to themselves understand this concept, what it means to them, and how they understand what the basis of consent should be. So I've got 3 discussion points. First of all, I'm going to look at, firstly, how do police scholars and the public and politicians at large, how do they principally see the purpose of the police in liberal Western democracies? And according to me, how should they view it? And secondly, I asked the same question with respect to the Middle East. So how do we see, how do outsider analysts and also our populations understand the purpose of the police in Middle Eastern context? And again, how should they? And I look at this overview because I want to make perhaps a controversial point that in an essential, fundamental respect, the purpose of police in both contexts is actually the same. And then I move on to specifically community policing in Jordan, and I look at an initiative that was set up in 2005 in Jordan, and the wider connotations of that. And again, I look at the views of the police themselves on this concept. So my methodology. My PhD, actually, I spent a couple of years in Jordan, and I did over 100 interviews with police and members of civil society, women's rights groups, tribal leaders. But the specific talk is based on 21 interviews with police officers, specifically police officers who talked about the concept of community policing. And in addition to that, I had 2 books that were given to me by the police about community policing. And also they have a range of in-house publications about the exploits or the projects of the police in Jordan. So that's the main basis of this research. So first of all, how do we see the purpose of police in our own liberal democracies? Essentially, the liberal view of police is that they are an organisation for law enforcement and crime prevention. This fundamental idea goes back to, in the UK, the foundation of the police, of the new police in the 1820s by Robert Peel. And his first principle for the police was that the police were established to combat crime and disorder. And that concept is really carried through not only in the UK but in North America, Japan, Europe. The idea that the police in a liberal democracy where rule of law is paramount or should be paramount, the police exist to reduce crime and to enforce the law. And it's been politically expedient, particularly in the 80s and 90s, and it's still very apparent in the rhetoric of politicians today. So we see a couple of years ago, Theresa May, in a report about the UK police, stated that the purpose of the police, the mission of the police is to cut crime, no more, no less. But empirically, when you look at what the police actually do, and this is again based on research in Europe and North America, they do very little, as a proportion of their work, very little of it is actually focused on combating crime and law enforcement. And the vast majority is much more to do with responding to emergencies, public relations, and various types of social work in a very broad sense. So reflecting this reality, there's an alternative school of thought that's put across essentially by critical criminologists, and that includes Marxists and other critical theorists, that actually the police should be understood in a much wider sense as enforcers or agents of social order. And there's, within this broad school, there's adherents of the new police science, which I myself would support, and they take on a Foucault, I know he pops up everywhere, but so they take on a Foucauldian idea about what the police is, or how they become what they are. And in this context, Foucault, he looks at the genealogy of the police in the 18th, 19th century, and how it was originally spoken about in Europe, where it referred to not only the law enforcement agency, but a whole raft of aspects of public administration. So it was morals, religion, street cleaning, factory conditions, all kinds of things. And it had to do with good governance in a broad sense. So new police scientists would argue that police today still have, that's how fundamentally we should understand police. And I take on board in particular the work of a Marxist, Mark Neophyth, who argues that in the UK and in Europe, the police were central in the production of a liberal social order. So I'm not a Marxist, and I don't believe that argument transfers directly to Jordan, but I do think that you can see the police being central to the production of social order, a different type of social order. So moving on to the Middle East, the picture is very different, and first of all, there is very little literature on policing in the Middle East, which is why I looked at it, but essentially the majority of work that looks either at the colonial period or contemporary focuses on the police as the state's coercive apparatus, or so either repression or surveillance. And those are the two main focuses that come across in the literature. And I don't want to deny that that is accurate by any means, but what I want to say is that it doesn't give us the full picture. And in fact, it's never always about violence. Like a big part of the story is about how the mundane practices happen on a day-to-day basis. And I think that looking at community policing is a very good way of showcasing that. And also with respect to the law, again, when there is a focus on policing and law in the Middle East, usually the focus has been on abuse of the law. So a lot of security sector reform projects have been focused on corruption and abuse in other terms of the law. Or if there's a complete absence of, in very violent parts of the Middle East, on a complete absence of law. So again, what I want to say is that police are not about law enforcement. Essentially, they're about the enforcement of social order, and that may or may not involve the enforcement of the law. So when we turn to Jordan, I think I might have skipped a slide or two. Oh dear. Oh well, they weren't that important. So when we turn to Jordan, police has always been, since the foundation of the Jordanian state, found a fundamental part in the creation of the state. Originally it was the Arab Legion. We think of that as being the army, but essentially it was a police force. It was an internal militarized police force. And it was central to the cooperation of the co-opting of tribes into the project of state in the 1920s and 30s. Subsequently, the police was officially separated from the army in 1956, and the police then developed under it was called the Public Security Directorate, and it has over the years become more and more expansive. And this is a diagram of the current organizational structure. And in fact, I had to cut them out because it's massive. But so they currently employ over 40,000 people, and within that, there are some very repressive arms. The unit of community policing comes under the jurisdiction of the public relations and moral instruction aide or commander. So, what does it entail? Well, so let me tell you how I kind of came to know about the community police. There's a website on the Public Security Directorate. It has a web page in which it lists all of the duties which it attributes to community policing. And they're incredibly broad, so the slide shows just a sampling of some of the duties that are supposedly part of community policing. And it also said on the slide that there was a unit that is responsible for community policing. So I asked if I could speak to the head of the unit and see what it was all about. And I met with him in 2012, 2011 first, and then again 2012, to ask about the initiative. So in 2005, initiative was set up in Amman, and it was subsequently spread to the rest of the provinces in 2008. So I asked him about this, and he said, well, actually there are only 258 employees, which is tiny. In an organisation of 40,000 people, it's a tiny number. But what I came to understand was that these employees are actually responsible for going around the provinces and training police officers in kind of ethical behaviour and dealing with the public. So that's ostensibly what their job is. But he said, well, this is only, essentially community policing is a, what he said was, it's a social duty, it's a comprehensive understanding of what security means. And in the course of my interviews with police across departments, the term came up again and again, in different contexts and from different officers working through all kinds of departments. So exploring what they really meant by that, well, there was one thing that they all agreed on, which was that part of community policing involves non-prosecution, or avoiding, in cases that don't have to go through the courts, because the courts are very slow and inefficient. This is an alternative mechanism that if both parties were willing to go to the police station and they'd bring their families along and they'd come to an arrangement, and so they didn't have to be a court case, then actually that was a much more satisfactory all round, according to them, solution. But other than that, there wasn't really much agreement on, well, there were three kind of discernible ideas about what this community policing really entails. And the first one was, came across in one of the books that they gave me, and it was very much a religious-based idea of the Muslim faithful, the Ummah, that all of the Jordanian people belong to this Muslim society, and that, actually, probably about 90+% of the population is Muslim. It's not entirely Muslim. But this was the foundation of community. So the quote on the board is out of the book that I got that kind of expresses that idea. In fact, most of my interviewees didn't really reflect that, and probably, partly because they were talking to a Westerner, but by far the most predominant idea was that the community is a tribal one, and that Jordan is a family of tribes, and the police facilitate or encourage tribal identity by encouraging tribal mechanisms for dispute resolution. And they have strong links with tribal leaders. And this was reinforced by dozens of interviews with tribal leaders who described their interactions with police. And so even though the majority of Jordanians today don't come from a tribal background, they don't come from the East Bank, the larger tribal East Bank background. They still have been kind of brought up in this culture of tribalism, and it is very much part of their cultural day-to-day social interactions. And then the third one, which was apparent in police officers I spoke to who worked in more kind of cosmopolitan parts of Amman that had Christian or Armenian or other minorities, was that community was bounded by geographic or administrative borders. So one officer gave the example of he'd met with some shopkeepers in Bayero who had asked him to help install CCTV cameras that would be connected to the police. And for him that was his identification of community policing. And again, it comes across in police who work for the Family Protection Department, which deals with domestic abuse. So they had a much more civic and, in some senses, liberal idea of what community should entail, and it involves civil and human rights. So these are the three main ideas. And rather than, so I'm moving on to the conclusions, because rather than, you could say that essentially these principles of community, they were just kind of telling me whatever, that it was all like But underpinning this, these are the fundamental ideas that do underpin the legitimacy of the Jordanian state and the monarchy. So still religion, I mean, the king makes a claim to descent from the prophet's grandfather, and for a large section of the population who don't kind of buy into the tribal identity ostensibly, that is an important sense of identity. On the other hand, I would argue that most people do actually buy into tribal identity because they actually do go along with the tribal practices that exist in Jordanian society. So consent doesn't have to be something which is spontaneous and joyful. It's just, it's something that people do on a day-to-day basis, and that is very obvious in tribal dispute resolution mechanisms. And so lastly, so this idea that, I mean, it's controversial in the sense that at the moment there's so much focus on violence in the region, and it's no wonder that we see the police in terms of their coercive capabilities. But I think that what's important is this is a way of understanding the other side to the story, and it's a way into seeing regime resilience and ways of evolving and surviving challenges. And so in that respect, consent is a way of describing what the Jordanian police are doing.
Thank you very much.